Hello and welcome. Coming up tonight, how can young people be trained for tomorrow's jobs? I'll ask the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Which taxes should the Chancellor put up? Ruth Curtice of the Resolution Foundation has a view. Is Trump's Gaza ceasefire already dead? The Palestinian analyst Ahmed Alkhatib will tell me. Pippa and Screeny know how big a threat the Greens are to Labour.
We'll look at which voters Zack Polanski is enticing and whether there's a ceiling to their support.
And throughout the show, agreeing to disagree on almost everything. We have True Blue, Katie Lam and Pretty Green, Zack Polanski. Watcher, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has said something no senior member of the government has had the courage to utter for years, that leaving the European Union damaged the UK's productivity and has therefore hurt growth and living standards. So is hers a tactical gambit, namely an attempt to distance herself from the economic stagnation that is the big cause of her need to raise around £30 billion from higher taxes in the budget next month? Or is there long-term strategy here? Have she and the Prime Minister decided to start making the case for much closer economic ties between the UK and European Union, partly perhaps to revive growth, but also for the first time to put clear red water between Labour on the one hand and the Eurosceptic Reform and Conservative parties on the other? Here's the nutshell. Has Keir Starmer belatedly come to the view that when he's seen as a Nigel Farage tribute act, toughening up rules for migrants who want to stay in the UK, heaping praise on Trump, waving the St George's flag, he's seen to be endorsing the Reform Party leader and, to paraphrase one of my favourite groups from about 30 years ago, XTC, doing what's best for Nigel, not for Labour. Shrivelling Labour support is not only linked to soaring reform, it's also associated with the surging popularity of today's guest, Zack Polanski and his Green Party, who've been recruiting members and supporters like nobody's business. So it may not be a coincidence that Reeves has also said her tax rises will be aimed, in part, at the wealthy. And Starmer has found the guts to differentiate from Trump and go to the COP Climate Change Summit in Brazil next month. Now, this is hardly Starmer reclaiming his erstwhile Corbynism leanings. I doubt Polanski is quaking in his boots, but it quacks a bit like a social democratic duck. Pippa.
Since politicians returned from party conferences, there's been a lot going on in the world. We've just had this in from YouGov, who asked people which one story they'd heard about most over the last week. As you can see, almost half mentioned either peace or conflict in the Middle East. Next is the latest row over Prince Andrew. The China spy case, which has caused waves in Westminster, has barely registered elsewhere. It was only mentioned by 3%. The same number highlighted the budget. So very little cut through on political stories for the main parties. But one group who are still gaining traction are the Greens, who, since Zack Polanski became leader at the start of September, have gone up by 3% in the polls. As you can see, they're now level with the Lib Dems. And look, their rise appears to correspond with a further fall in support for Labour. Much of Keir Starmer's focus has been on preventing flooding to reform. But, as we've mentioned before, he's losing twice as many voters to progressive parties. So how do Green supporters compare to other parties? This chart by Ben Ansell uses data from the British election study, who asked voters questions about economic and cultural issues. The further to the left the dot is, the more left-wing you are economically, and the further down this chart, the more socially liberal you are. Look at the gap. Green voters are much further away from even the average Labour voter on their own little island down here in this corner. And with the Greens on the rise with a very specific type of voter, is there a limit to their popular support? It probably isn't a surprise that polling shows that over half of people, the Green bits here, say they would trust them on the environment and climate. But what about the other issues which are most important to voters? Zack has said he is unashamedly pro-migration. Perhaps this might be a problem, as only 23% of voters trust the Greens on immigration. They also have big ideas on the economy, such as a wealth tax, yet only 21% would trust them with the nation's finances. Robert.
Gosh, so much to talk about. Actually, the first thing I want to talk about is why did you and Katie get the dress code memo? and Zack and I, somehow, quite it's your colours. You're not even wearing the right colours, Zack. But anyway...
That's cut through.
Yeah.
Let's start with the migration point. You know, your position on migration does appear to be sort of overwhelmingly unpopular. Are the British people wrong to want immigration numbers to come down?
No, British public aren't wrong, but it's also true that they've been pumped stories, negative stories about migration for decades now. And in fact, the Prime Minister said we're squeamish about talking about immigration. It feels to me like we rarely talk about anything else. Now,
It does sound as though you're saying voters are wrong.
Well, no, I'm not. It's just that 5% of migration is for small boats, but I think it covers about 95% of the coverage we hear about. And ultimately, I think we need politicians to tell the public the truth and to make sure we're winning people over with the fact that the problems in our country are multimillionaires and
Would
billionaires.
you bring down controlled legal migration? Would you massively restrict the numbers who are allowed to have visas?
Well, I think it would be ludicrous to do that because we have 150,000 vacancies in the NHS for starters. Now, of course, we need to train British workers as well, but actually there are huge skills gaps, particularly in the green transition and the green economy, where actually we need to be training people up, both British workers and people who are coming over here looking for a home.
Katie, you take a very different view. I was very interested in your interview in The Times at the weekend, and you said something that I genuinely didn't understand. You said there are people who've come here legally but shouldn't have been able to, and they should leave. But who are these people who came legally and should leave?
Well, there are a number of different routes. I mean, perhaps one of the most classic routes to use as an example is one that the government has already said that they'll close, the health and social care visa, which was forecast to bring 6,000 people a year and has brought 600,000 people, including their dependents.
But how do you? But I mean, if they've come here legally, how can you ask them to go?
Well, if you've come here on a 5-year visa, then at the end of the 5 years, it's time to go home, and I think that that's totally reasonable.
So that's all you're saying. You're just simply saying that you would have different rules on right to remain. That's what you're.
There's a couple of different things. So the Conservative Party policy, per some amendments that we laid earlier this year and a deportations bill that Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, laid, is that if you have come here legally but you can no longer support yourself or you commit a crime, then you need to go home because those were not the conditions under which you came.
Sure, but that is not hundreds of thousands of people. And you did make this other point, which I would be very interested to know what you meant by it. You said that if these very large numbers of people left, we would have what you called a culturally coherent country or a more culturally coherent country. What is a more culturally coherent country?
Well, there is a gathering view now, which I subscribe to, that multiculturalism has not succeeded in this country, that what you need is one culture for a country to be a success. Now, you can be a multi-ethnic culture, you can be a multiracial culture, but you need one national culture for a people to live together in harmony and prosperity.
I'm not sure you agree, do you, Zack?
No, I think diversity is one of the best things about this country. This country was built on migration, and of course we should celebrate people who were born here, but also people who come here and make this their home too. And actually, I think that's part of being a patriot, is the care and compassionate approach towards others. I think that's part of being British.
So what is Zack saying that you think is wrong?
Well, firstly, this country wasn't built on migration. There have been, throughout our history, different waves of immigration, but this country was built on the British people. Now, it's totally true.
Well, we go back to 1066, we can talk about lots of very big waves of...
And that's happened throughout the entire history of our country. But to say that the country was built on migration is simply not true. Now, there are lots of people around the world, exceptional people, that we would want to come to this country and contribute. There are also, sadly, lots and lots of people around the world who live very, very difficult lives, and in our compassion, we extend a hand to some of them.
But can I just ask you on that very specific point? Obviously, we've had, you know, an indigenous population for a sort of longer period, for example, in a slightly more dominant position than in America. But America is absolutely a country that was totally built on migration. Is America a failed state?
I think in many ways, America is a very culturally incoherent state, and I think that that is a massive problem.
I think it depends who creates cultural coherence, and actually that's not for one person to do. It's certainly not for politicians to do. That's for communities to do. We had 14 years of Conservative austerity that has destroyed integration because we don't have community centres, we don't have arts and culture, and we need to tell that collective
If it's
story.
not for politicians to create community cohesion, then those things wouldn't have changed that.
Well, look, there's so much more on this and other things we're going to come back to you about, but I do now have to go to Pippa because we're going to change subject actually quite significantly.
We are, Robert. Our guest, the Education Secretary, has been busy today on two fronts. University fees will now be going up in line with inflation every year. They were frozen between 2017 and 2024, but the new Labour government have now changed course on that. But I want to talk about a big number that has been troubling Bridget, Phillipson and Pat McFadden. Julia Dinez and Louise Murphy from the Resolution Foundation have just estimated that 940,000 young people are NEET. This means they're not in education, employment or training. 1 in 8 of all young people, with 75,000 of them under the age of 18. Now, the number was falling since the 2000s, and changes were introduced in 2013 to make education or training mandatory for all those under 17, and then again in 2015 to everyone under 18. But as you can see on this chart, the rate dropped below 5% in 2012, but hasn't really fallen much further since, and is now creeping back up with a huge long-term impact. This isn't felt evenly across the country. In Dudley, 21.5% of 16 to 17-year-olds are either NEETs or the government doesn't even know what they're up to. That's 1 in 5 young people without immediate prospects, 4 times the English average. Robert.
Thanks. Now, a little earlier, I talked to the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Obviously, I did get on to that big point that Pippa was making about the numbers of young people who just seem to have been completely abandoned by the education system and are not in work either. But I started by asking why she was increasing tuition fees so much by the rate of inflation, in her words, forever, given that students are struggling to afford their debts already and there is growing evidence that getting a degree does not guarantee decent employment.
So I do think that university still represents a fantastic route for young people. It's not the only route, and that's why today we're also announcing plans to strengthen technical and vocational routes for our young people too. But I have made the decision and made the announcement today that we will be increasing tuition fees for the next 2 years with a move towards legislating when parliamentary time allows to make that automatic every year, because our universities do need to be financially sustainable into the future in order to create those opportunities for young people so they can go on and study. But these have to be high quality courses. And what I've also set out today is that the Office for Students, the regulator, will bring forward a new framework of quality to make sure that outcomes for students are good, that teaching quality is good, and that we can be really confident about all of that as well.
And can I just ask, you've said that when you have time to legislate for the future inflation increases, that universities that are supplying shoddy courses won't get the inflation increase. But will there also be scope for the Office for Students to say to those universities, you've actually got to cut the price of what you're charging?
So the Office for Students will be consulting about this new quality framework to make sure that it's going to the highest quality providers. I should just say, alongside the increase that I'm setting out around tuition fees, we're also increasing maintenance loans too, so that students are able to get the support they need around the cost of living. And for the first time, we're also going to make it automatic that care leavers will be able to receive the full maintenance loan, which is a step forward and I think a welcome, will be really welcome for some of the most vulnerable children in our country, those who've been through the social care system. But alongside that, I'm also going to introduce new targeted maintenance grants for disadvantaged students in key industrial strategy areas so that they get the support they need through a grant as well as through the options that already exist.
I mean, I'm sure all of that will be very widely welcomed. But when it comes to poor-performing universities, it's not just that some of them are supplying substandard courses, it's also there's been financial incompetence, and yet you're bailing them out.
Look, we did inherit a huge challenge where it came to the financial sustainability of the sector. A part of that was because for 7 years the Conservatives failed to increase tuition fees, so the value eroded over time. I took the decision last year to increase tuition fees for the first time in 7 years to support our universities, because they're so important to our regional economy, to growth and to much more besides. But I do want a firm focus from university vice-chancellors and from institutions on high quality, on better outcomes for students, but also that they need to make university an option available to much more young, to much greater number of young people from less well-off backgrounds. There is still a big challenge there.
As I mentioned, I'm sure lots of people will be pleased that you're providing maintenance support arrangements for those on the lowest incomes. But if you're just above that threshold and you're already terrified about the debts you'll be taking on, many of those people will just choose not to go to university now. Aren't you concerned about that?
I have been concerned about what I've heard from students around the cost of living. That's why we are committing to increasing maintenance loans alongside increasing tuition fees. But it's also
But what about
why I've
those
taken
who
the
don't
step.
quite make the threshold? That's my concern.
And that's why I'm also taking the step of bringing forward plans for new targeted maintenance grants to address directly that. But I do think there is also a role for institutions as well to work together more with their further education colleges to provide really good routes through for all young people.
Go to a slightly younger cohort. We've got some data from the Resolution Foundation which shows that a staggering 75,000 16 and 17-year-olds are neither in education or training. Some of them have just gone missing. This is really appalling, isn't it?
I mean, we face a really enormous and profound challenge about young people who are not in education, employment or training. 1 in 7 overall across the country, higher in certain communities. And through the white paper today, we've set out a number of measures to address that. So one such measure is making sure that as young people leave school at 16, that they're guaranteed a place and are given a place by a provider in their local area to make sure that come September, they've got wraparound support, that people look out for them and make sure that they're moving into employment, training or education. Because too many young people drop off at that point.
But can I just ask you, on the basis of what you're proposing, why do you think that 1 in 5 16 and 17-year-olds in a place like Dudley have just given up on education or training or anything constructive?
I think it tells us something quite profound and quite worrying about the extent to which, in many communities across our country, young people and their families feel disengaged from education. And that's why through the Schools White Paper that I'll be setting out, we will also address that big challenge around young people really wanting to be in school, to belong in school, and being able to both achieve but also thrive. And that does feed through into our post-16 system as well. But particularly for those young people who finish at school, a school that perhaps doesn't have a sixth form, they then have to move on to another college or to another sixth form at the age of 16. Many young people fall by the wayside in that point, and that's why working to make better use of the data, to identify who these young people are, to put in place the support that's required, but also the backstop of a place and a local education provider will also be critical in stopping those young people just dropping out of the system, because in some cases they need just extra support, extra guidance and that wraparound support.
On the deputy leadership election, you're reaching the final few furlongs. Closing is on Thursday. Are you confident you're going to win?
Well, I'm in it to win it, but we'll wait and see what the result is. I feel I fought a strong campaign. I've made the case to members for, why change isn't just something that we have to talk about as a party. Change is something that we have to deliver, and we must deliver more of.
Finally, and maybe it's unfair that people see you as the Prime Minister's candidate, but they do see you as the Prime Minister's candidate. So were you to lose, would that be a judgment on you? Or is it actually a judgment on the Prime Minister?
Look, I'm my own woman and I'm my own candidate in this contest, and I fought this contest on why I feel I'm the person best placed to unite the party, to beat reform and to be that strong voice for members and our movement at the Cabinet table. Because I am proud of what we've achieved. There is more we need to do, especially on child poverty, and I've made that my #1 priority in this campaign. But I also want our government to succeed, and I want our Prime Minister to succeed. That's what our members, that's what our movement want to, and that's what I'll deliver if I'm elected as Deputy Leader.
Bridget, very good to see you as always.
Thank you.
Come back soon. Thanks again.
Now, Zack, the government says that without a rise in fees, universities will go bust. What do the Greens say?
This is why marketisation has completely failed. If you rely on the private sector to run universities on what should be a basic human right for people to be able to educate themselves, you get into these ridiculous situations. 1 in 3 children are living in poverty. We just heard about neat children there. Meanwhile, billionaire wealth collectively goes up £35 million a day. I think ultimately the government needs to be looking at the multimillionaires and billionaires to be making sure we're redistributing that wealth, including for education.
But we know that money is extremely tight and you can't do everything. So how high up on your list of priorities would funding university education be?
Well, partly I reject the idea that money is really tight. I think we'll always see tricky decisions for university students, for migrants, for disabled people. When are we going to see tricky decisions for the very wealthy in society? That being said, education is a huge priority for me and for the Green Party. And absolutely, I'm pleased to see that this is being extended, the maintenance loans, to care experienced young people. But I thought Robert's questions were right there. What about the young people who are just above the threshold? They're just going to be left out to dry, and that can't be OK.
So, Katie, money isn't tight. You can lift fees entirely, perhaps, and reinstate tuition
government
grants.
spending is at what, 45% of the nation's GDP. It's what, £17,000 per person. I mean, it's certainly true that the government spend a lot of our money on things I think many members of the public would rather that they didn't. But it is not true, unfortunately, that there is an infinite pool of wealth that can just be tapped at any time. Particularly the sorts of people that Zack is talking about are very successful, are very internationally mobile, and they will leave the country. And as we've already seen, they are.
Isn't that the danger, Zack?
I don't think there's an infinite pool of wealth at all, but there is a pool of wealth. And actually, lots of these people have wealth in assets, and it's not easy to, particularly if they're buildings. The Duke of Westminster owns half of Mayfair. He can't just take up that asset and be internationally mobile.
But he can, as he did, sell 25% of his real estate portfolio.
Well, let's make sure that we go for the other 75%. So it's ultimately about making sure that we're taxing wealth and not work.
And Katie, I want to ask you something about completely different that MPs have been discussing, because you've been a strong campaigner on sexual abuse against women. So do you think the Parliament should legislate to remove Prince Andrew's titles?
I think that that's a matter for the royal family and ultimately for the king. And it seems, my sense of what we've seen now and a few months ago is that he is the king. It's very much on his mind. What I think is definitely the case is that any allegations need to be thoroughly investigated. But what happens next is a matter for the royal family.
But not even as a matter of principle?
No, I think that this is a decision for the king.
OK. Well, thank you both very much. Robert?
Thanks, that was fascinating. So, after the break, we're obviously going to go for a comedy turn, because if you're an actuary, you will think this headline, A Cruel World, is absolutely hilarious. The rest of you will pass you by. But what we are mostly going to be talking about is how the Chancellor raises maybe up to £50 billion in tax, given that she's promised that the biggest taxes, these are the ones in blue, she says she's not going to touch. She's got to raise all that money from these taxes. Can she really do it? Join me after the break. Well, I'll be talking to the head of the Resolution Foundation about all this and more. She's called Ruth Curtice.
And welcome to the break. Now, the Prince problem has obviously been rumbling on over the last few days, over the weekend, and ahead of the publication of Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Prince Andrew has announced that he's going to give up his royal titles, including the Duke of York. Giuffre alleged that she was trafficked to the Prince by convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein when she was just 17, and on 2 other occasions, claims of which he, of course, has denied. Zack, what's your position on the monarchy, and do you think that Andrew giving up his titles is sufficient?
I mean, I don't support the monarchy at all, but I think actually what we need to do here is centre the survivors and indeed the deceased. It's a whole sordid affair. It's pretty grim. And I think ultimately it's yet again another abuse of power, another abuse of a man in power. And I think you can both criticise the systems that are in place and recognise that all needs to change. and also recognise this is about a specific individual who also needs to face consequences.
What do you think, Katie?
Well, we were talking about it earlier. I mean, I think that there has to be a full investigation of all of the allegations. And only then, really, will we know exactly what it is that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no question that some of the things that are described are just horrible.
Yeah. And the Met, of course, said that they're going to be investigating claims that Prince Andrew tried to obtain personal information about Virginia Giuffre through his police protection. Do you think it's going to get worse for the royal family before it gets better?
I mean, I have no special insight, but I would imagine that the steps that have been taken today are an indication that there might be more to come.
Yeah. And the question to you about mechanisms that MPs could use to strip the royals of their titles, or in this particular case, Prince Andrew, is that something that you would support, or the Queen's is supporting?
I mean, I partly go back to my previous answer that I think we need to centre the survivors and the people who have been abused. And I feel to get into conversations about titles almost distracts the conversation from actually what is an abuse of power.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Welcome back. Now, we're going to talk about the challenge for the Chancellor to fill a bit of a black hole in her budget next month. And I'm delighted to be joined by former Treasury official, head of the Resolution Foundation, Ruth Curtice. Now, I warned people before the break this is going to be a comedy classic. We're going to start with one of my favourite concepts, fiscal headroom. Now, what this means for those who aren't sort of using it every single day, it's the amount of sort of cushion, rainy day money that the Chancellor has to deal with shocks. And since we had these fiscal rules and had the Office of Budget Responsibility, we can see from this chart that successive chancellors, starting with Osborne, then Hammond, had, anywhere between... Well, I mean, there was one point where George Osborne had 80 billion of fiscal headroom, but, it was sort of averaging 30-odd billion for years and years and years. And then Jeremy Hunt did some pre-election tax bribes, cut national insurance, took it down to 10. And then at the start of this Parliament, Rachel Reeves took her rainy day money down to 10. And, of course, the economy has changed since the last budget and it's been wiped away, which is a big reason why she's going to have to raise taxes. So was she just being reckless in having so little headroom?
So, as you say, she had much less headroom than chancellors in the past. Another way we can think about that is what's the average move every time the OBR do a forecast? That's about 17 billion. So you can think of this as...
So she had even less than the average shock to the system.
Exactly. So the average could go either way, but she's had a bad roll of the dice and she didn't have enough to cover even a typical bad roll of the dice.
Now, if she were to do the prudent thing, well, should she do the prudent thing in this coming budget and rebuild headroom? And what would that mean as far as you're concerned? How much rainy day money should she tuck away if she's doing the right thing?
Yeah, so headroom can sound a bit abstract.
Yeah.
So we should be clear, when we say more headroom, that means more tax rises or lower spending than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah.
So that's why this is not a straightforward decision. But given that the UK cost of borrowing is now one of the highest amongst rich economies, given we're paying a price in the bond market for our borrowing levels, it does seem like increasing that headroom, also from the Chancellor's point of view, does she want to be back here again next year, or does she want to allow herself a bit more of a cushion to hopefully mean that this budget is her last tax-raising budget?
But that would mean, and we're going to move on now and talk about her tax options, but let's just say she adds another 20 billion to headroom. So headroom's been wiped out. Just to rebuild the headroom, that's 30 billion. But we know the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's downgraded growth, downgraded productivity, that's another 20 billion. She's got the problem that interest rates are higher than she thought. She's got the problem that she's not made the welfare savings she was expecting to do. So she could be facing 50 billion of, if she rebuilds headroom, she could be facing 50 billion of tax rises. Now, I pointed out before the break, she can't raise any of those taxes on the left because she said in her manifesto she couldn't. So what's she going to do?
So as you say, there's lots of things that she's ruled out. I'd add two things on this chart. One is the blobs are small. The sort of orange blobs are small relative to the other blobs. They're still quite big. So there's still hundreds of billions of pounds of taxes that aren't in her ruled out bucket. But really what we need to think about is, would it be sensible to stick to the commitments not to touch these big tax bases?
So what's the answer?
So we think that she should protect working people, but that she should look at areas where employment is overtaxed relative to other forms of income.
So what would that mean?
So in particular, one thing she could do is put up income tax, but cut national insurance. What that would mean is that anyone's tax on their pay packet would stay the same for people in employment. The self-employed would be asked to pay a little bit more, and pensioners would be asked to pay a little bit more. But for example, if she did that by 2p, only pensioners earning over £40,000 will be worse off when you take into account the extra money they're going to get from the triple lock next year.
Although I think you agree with me that she's facing raising anywhere between, I don't know, 25 and 50 billion, right? Your proposal raises how much?
Yeah, so that raises about 6 or 7 billion. So she would have to do.
So where's the rest coming from?
She would have to do a collection of these things. We've set up about 30 billion pounds of proposals for tax rises that she could make that we think would follow these principles of evening out the taxation of different forms of income. And recognising that income that is undertaxed relative to employment is an area where, in this very tough situation, she could turn.
Now, one of the interesting things is what the British people would like to see in terms of tax changes. And I thought this was an absolutely fascinating bit of polling by Demos. And they asked all categories of voters, would you rather see higher taxes on work, basically income taxes, or on wealth, which is a rather broad concept? And broadly, in every category, including Reform and the Tories, they all say tax wealth more. Now, I suppose, is that rational? Can she raise enough money from raising so-called wealth taxes?
Well, so briefly, I wouldn't say that tax on work and income tax are the same. There are some forms of income that aren't work, and that is an area we should
Which you've just talked about, which is so unearned income, for example.
Exactly.
You'd like to see national insurance on, wouldn't you?
Exactly. But thinking about kind of the idea of wealth taxes, we do already have some taxes on wealth. I think we should say the kind of economic drivers here, it's understandable why you get results like this. So wealth as a proportion of the economy has something like doubled since the 1980s. Wealth taxes have stayed very constant. So that might be why people feel like we should tax wealth more and we should tax it better. We've got these existing wealth taxes like capital gains tax. They look like easier ways for the Chancellor to find money this autumn than the ideas like an annual wealth tax, which would face a lot of kind of practical challenges.
And just on that, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, should there be a new top band on expensive houses for council tax?
Yeah.
As you say, should she raise the rate of capital gains tax and equalise it with income taxes? But what is the history of pure wealth taxes around the world? Do they work in raising significant sums of money?
So in recent years, we've seen countries move away from annual wealth taxes, not from things like property taxes and capital gains taxes.
And why is that, do you think?
They tend to raise less money than was hoped for, and they tend to see very big behavioural effects, whether those are people leaving the country or whether those are people avoiding the tax, because it's very hard to value some of these forms of wealth. The other thing is most of the wealth in this country is in property and pensions. So when we talk about a wealth tax, we need to think about, are we prepared to tax houses more? Are we prepared to tax pensions more? Because that's where most of the wealth is. Ruth,
it's been a joy having you on the programme. I promised people that it would be a comedy classic. I'm not sure I've quite fulfilled that dream.
Sorry,
but I'm now going to go over to Pippa, because I think there's a ton of stuff that you want to pick up with our other guests.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robert. And it is really striking, isn't it, how popular wealth taxes look like they might be. But as Ruth says, potentially bringing in less money and behavioural change. And if you're not looking just at the existing taxes and adding to those instead. You've gone for a new wealth tax, the Greens, haven't you? How is that going to work?
So it's a tax on assets, 1% on £10 million or more, or 2% on £1 billion or more. But I think what was really striking there is the most obvious win here is to bring capital gains tax in line with income tax. The reason why that's important is right now we tax earned income more than we tax unearned wealth. That means if you're a cleaner, you could be paying more tax than the person who owns the building that you're cleaning. That's completely absurd. It's a political choice. We can make different political choices.
Equalising CGT, Katie, is that an option
Well,
you'd look at?
That, in my opinion, is a massive penalty for somebody who builds a business. And we need more of these people. We need aspiration. We need people to be creating businesses, to be creating jobs. It's a massive risk to do that. You know, the people who create the enterprises that make the world go around are doing so at huge risk to themselves. And the idea that that should be charged at the same level as income, which is much steadier and more reliable, I think would have a huge chilling effect on enterprise throughout the economy.
The idea I'd love to bring to the table that I think was missing from that conversation is the idea of spending multipliers. So when Ruth says, for instance, it's difficult to find wealth, there's practical challenges. Yes, there are, but let's spend more money on HMRC. Spending that money, essentially spending to invest, means that you've got more people to be able to tax that wealth fairly. Same with the National Health Service. If we keep underspending on it, it shouldn't be a surprise when we have a sick population. So yes, you're spending some money up front on our public infrastructure, on our services, but we're getting that money back in terms of a much better economy and a healthier population.
Now, talking of spending, Katie, your party has suggested almost £50 billion worth of cuts at your conference a couple of weeks ago. And a big chunk of that would come from welfare reform. You were in Downing Street under Boris Johnson, and I presumably had the opportunity then in government, not you personally, but the government, to pull the levers on welfare then. Why didn't that happen?
Well, a lot of the changes that we've seen, and particularly the acceleration that we've seen in welfare, has happened since the pandemic. So when I worked in Number 10 in 2019 and 2020, the situation was nothing like as acute as it is now. And so what did happen, I think, is that there are various ways in which we could have got to grips with this. Again, I wasn't there, I wasn't a member of Parliament. Perhaps in the last year or so that we were in government, when this problem was really manifesting itself after the pandemic. But that is our policy now.
And Zack, from what we've heard, this government is going to come back with a further round of welfare cuts.
Absolutely outrageous. And the idea that we would have any spending cuts. People in this country are tired and they're exhausted. They're seeing their cost of living raise and they're not seeing their wages go with it. And they're really, really struggling. And again, we have wealth in this country that we can redistribute. So the idea that people who are already struggling as a result of political consequences and decisions over decades are going to have to suffer another round of cuts. It's not a surprise to me that when Nigel Farage talks about connecting with people's fear and anger, that he's doing so well. Now, of course, I'd say this, reforms solutions will make things even worse. That's why I think the Greens are doing so well right now. We're offering hope and some practical solutions to say we don't need to cut spending, and actually we need to tax the wealthiest in this country more and invest in our public services.
But we're talking about thousands of young people here who aren't working, and if they spend at least a year out of work, likely never will. That's not a kindness to them.
Yep. OK, thank you both. Robert.
Thanks. Absolutely fascinating conversation. Now, we're now going to change subject again, and we're going to look at the very uneasy ceasefire in Gaza. And joining me is Ahmed Alkhatib. He is Palestinian. He's based in America. Last week, Ahmed, we had a very moving interview with Sharon Lifshitz, whose parents were taken hostage by Hamas, and, you know, tragically, her father was murdered, but her extraordinary mother is somebody who absolutely believes in peace and reconciliation. Now, you've suffered, terrible tragedies in your family, multiple deaths amongst friends of yours and family in Gaza. How optimistic are you that we are at an important turning point and that this ceasefire will hold?
Well, thanks so much for speaking with me. I am perpetually optimistic that Gaza will have better days ahead, that Gaza will have a chance at rebuilding. And I'm certainly hopeful that what we saw last week with the ceasefire can be an anchor point for what comes next in terms of a political process, the rebuilding process, surging of humanitarian aid, a recovery of the civilians, the road to recovery, I should say. I'm certainly grateful that the bombs have largely stopped falling, that people are in desperate need of respite and a rest, really, from 2 years of the most painful chapter in contemporary Palestinian history. Nevertheless, let's not be all rosy here. The fact of the matter is that this is, in my assessment, and that of many observers, merely a ceasefire and a hostage exchange deal. One that I welcome wholeheartedly. And I know Sharon, and I met her when I was last in the UK, and I'm relieved that the Israeli hostages have been released back to their loved ones, at least the living ones, and some of the deceased ones. And certainly relieved for some of the Palestinian families who've had their the detained sons returned to them. That actually included, well, supposed to include my sister-in-law's brother, who was scooped up by the Israeli military last April, but unfortunately was not released in this deal. Nevertheless, Hamas is refusing to disarm. Hamas is refusing to exit the scene. Hamas is not accepting a board of peace or any of the broad framework, if you will, that was put forth by President Trump, causing many to be concerned about the future of this deal.
And when you saw the reports of Hamas executing Palestinians who they saw as somehow rivals for control of Gaza, what did you think, frankly, should happen to stop that?
Well, I was particularly horrified. I was horrified for some of the people that I've been connected with over the past 2 years. I have a very large network in Gaza of dissidents, of social media activists, journalists, humanitarian workers, and others who are opposed to Hamas, contrary to the portrayal in a lot of media circles. The majority of Gazans are truly done with Hamas. They are viewing this as kind of the icing on the cake, if you will, of 20 years of Hamas's rule since 2005 and the disengagement. And Hamas, instead of looking at the disaster it unleashed upon our people, handing the Palestinian people in Gaza to the most far-right government in Israel's history, it emerged cowardly from its tunnels after it left the people of Gaza facing a ferocious Israeli war machine, and it started killing, torturing, maiming, disappearing, intimidating, interrogating people for the slightest of transgressions or perceived transgressions, while also affirming that we are here, we're not going anywhere. I was horrified by where was the role of Qatar and Turkey? Where was the US and the Trump administration, which I'm grateful for their work, but why was President Trump out there saying that we gave Hamas permission to do what it needs to do, only to shift course 2 days later? And most importantly, where are the hordes of the pro-Palestine protesters that have clogged Western capitals for the last 2 years, proclaiming to care about Palestinian lives, only to be completely silent when a terror Islamist fascist organization is maiming and killing those same Palestinian lives?
So, Ahmed, there's a ton more I need to ask you about, in particular, given that Trump has said he wants to bring lasting, sustainable peace, what he needs to do next. So, Ahmed, don't go away. And all of you at home, this is obviously an important interview. Come back for the rest of it.
Welcome back to the break. Now, we have got two multi-talented guests on the sofa tonight. Both of them have graced the world of theatre, worked in the world of theatre. Zack, you used to be an actor, and Katie, you've written five, wow, big musicals, including an adaptation of The Railway Children. So, Katie, if you were going to adapt a politician's life for musical, who would it be?
To be totally honest with you, I'm not sure that politics, maybe Zack has a different view, is what in theatre we would call box office in terms of a topic for adapting for a musical. But I think, I don't know, you go for somebody iconic, maybe somebody classical like Cleopatra or somebody.
So not Trump the musical or anything like that?
I don't think so.
I would have gone for Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson.
I feel like there's enough
plenty of
buffoonery
material.
there. Exactly.
Plenty of material. And Zack, are there any politicians that you think would make particularly good actors? Some might say politicians act quite a lot anyway, don't they?
I mean, without getting too wonky about it, acting is the genuine communication of authenticity.
Right.
And so I think some politicians might struggle with that. I think there are lots of politicians though, that I think when you hear them speaking and you believe them, they probably make good actors too.
Keir Starmer?
Probably not one for the list.
Oh, right. And Katie, if you were going to cast Zack in one of your musicals, what role would you give him?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. Do you sing?
Yes.
What part do you
not
sing?
now, live.
Go on.
And now.
I'm a tenor.
Okay. Do you mean in the musical canon?
Anything you like.
I think. Well, we've got Westminster Side Story. I can totally see you doing one of the main roles in West Side Story. I think that would be.
Okay. So the train doesn't sing in The Railway Children. I want it to be the train.
Gonna be
No.
a boring.
Oh my God, no! The train is off stage.
I'm going to be a boring know-it-all. Hamilton is a political musical.
There we go.
It
It is. And that's
It
the end.
is.
That is the end of the break. We can
That's
sing
why I
afterwards.
went old school.
Thank
I'm
you
saying
very much.
now.
Welcome back. I'm delighted that Ahmed Alkhatib is still with me, Palestinian analyst, talking to us from Washington. So, given that Trump has said it's his priority to design a lasting peace, what does he need to do now?
I think first and foremost, he needs to continue the pressure on the Qatari and Turkish mediators who have proven that when they want to apply pressure on Hamas, they got the terror group to give up all 20 of the living hostages. And so they do have leverage. They are Hamas's last hope for a lifeline to the outside world. Number two is, I would say, transparency when it comes to this transitional apparatus. We've heard bits and pieces about former UK Prime Minister Blair being involved. Then we've heard about the Egyptians and the Arabs being involved in some kind of a technocratic committee and a transitional body. Then we've heard different ideas.
But can I ask on that transitional, the so-called, I think it's called a peace board. Would you be interested in joining the peace board?
Though I've never held any political aspirations to hold office in a Palestinian capacity. Of course, I want to serve my people in whatever capacity or whatever shape that looks like. I'm happy to fulfill it. But nevertheless, there's no clarity. And because of this lack of clarity, you have allegations of businessmen and wealthy oligarchs in the Palestinian street and in the West Bank potentially being invited to be a part of it. Then you have rumors about a whole host of non-Palestinians residing on said board. But what I've been promoting behind the scenes is that you need actual Palestinians. You cannot just have a bunch of self-interested millionaires and oligarchs. Yes, I'm a capitalist. I respect the business class, but you need regular Palestinians, the academics, the journalists, the young people in particular, who are going to inspire a new generation. And that thus far has been missing. So I would push Trump on that. I would push him on the International Stabilization Force. And there's different nomenclature used, stabilization versus peacekeeping, because stabilization is something that's a little bit more pragmatic, it's more agile, you can rapidly deploy it, and you need something that's not the useless UN peacekeeping static forces we see in southern Lebanon. You need something with teeth. You need something that can fight back against Hamas and against terror. So those are the 3 points that I would push on for the immediate future.
And Ahmed, I'm just going to ask you on a slightly more parochial, closer to home question. I don't know if you were aware, but the police in the Midlands recently said that supporters of Tel Aviv Football Club, the Maccabees, were not allowed to come here because they couldn't guarantee their safety. Some people have said that looks to them like somehow, anti-Semitism in sort of practice. What do you feel about it?
Well, this is part of the narrative issues that have emerged since October 7th, in which, unfortunately, the umbrella, what you would call pro-Palestine movement globally, and particularly in the Western world, have adopted a lot of intense rhetoric, a lot of maximalist rhetoric. Many might mean well, many might have their heart in the right place, but I feel like this particular move is part of a trend in which there is a double standard that's being applied. And by the way, I say this as someone who's wholeheartedly pro-Palestine and pro-my people and not apologetic for the problematic and horrible behavior we see on the part of the Israeli government and members of the Israeli society. But to preemptively deny people the presence based on their national origin, to me, screams of racism and prejudice. That's no different than saying, well, Muslims were associated with terrorism in the past, so we're going to deny them presence here. How would that be viewed? Or that's no different than saying, well, a lot of the pro-Palestine protesters have a tendency of displaying anti-Semitic signs, so we're going to deny them a license. I think there were some members of parliament who had a very partisan message, and they ran on a platform that was specific to incite these divisive languages in society. And I don't think that's good for the Palestinian people, for the Muslim people in the United Kingdom, and certainly for communal relations.
Ahmed, fantastic talking to you. Really interesting interview. I hope you'll come back soon. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Zack, I do have to therefore put to you, I mean, Ahmed has said that, banning the Maccabee fans was wrong. Your deputy leader endorsed the banning of the Maccabee fans. So where are you on it?
Well, I'm one of 5 people in British history that have been Jewish and the leader of a British political party. So I take anti-Semitism really seriously. I don't think this was anti-Semitic at all, though. There's a very big difference between being Jewish and supporting the Israeli
But your
state.
deputy leader went further and said that, in general, he wanted to see a general boycott of Israeli sports teams. You can't endorse that, can you?
I absolutely endorse that. In the same way we have with Russia, we're currently seeing an ongoing genocide. And actually, I think it's important that athletes are allowed to play, but to play under their state banner or a city in Israel, I think is deeply problematic.
But Israel, you have to accept Israel as a democracy, and you're basically punishing essentially innocent citizens for, it's perfectly reasonable to criticise the Israeli government, but to punish citizens in that way is surely not appropriate.
Well, first of all, protesters who were on the flotilla recently were subject to torture. They were kept in dark rooms all day. They were not treated how any democracy...
Annoyingly, I'm told, which is really frustrating because I wanted to bring Katie in, but I'm out of time. That's it. So here's my closing thought. Given we've learned that China is hacking all the government's confidential information, but this is nothing to lose by simply answering the questions when they come on the show. What about it, eh? Goodbye.